Greetings, my name is Slight, and this is a Gunfire Reborn solo reincarnation tier list for Tau. If you're looking for nothing more than a comprehensive tier list for this character during gameplay, let me explain how to use it first, and then you can feel free to pause the video. Number 1, I've listed these builds based on their consistency and the highest ranks of reincarnation. So the Swords Out defensive build is, in my opinion, more consistent than the Blade of Bloom build in these higher difficulties. Number 2, you should be reading this tier list from top to bottom and left to right. The order I have these listed in is a bit complex looking at first, but as you play these builds and are actually choosing Ascensions, I'm sure it'll make a lot more sense. Number 3, the Situationally OP category here is broadly referring to using Ammo Extractor with numerous no reload synergies and Flower Chain with the Thunderclap gloves. Okay, that should get you able to use the list. Feel free to pause, and I'll go ahead and get started with the explanation. At the very bottom of our tier list, we're going to start with Empathy with the Sword. Empathy with the Sword says when dealing weapon damage, or any damage at level 3 to an enemy, there's a 10% chance to summon a flying sword with an additional amount of skill damage to the same enemy. In general, this Ascension lacks a lot of utility. 10% is a very low chance for one sword. I mean, the swords in general are meant to do lots and lots of damage. So a 10% chance for one sword is very, very little damage. It is one extra hit, but only 10% of the time. The 50% and 100% skill damages, which are additive, are paltry. And this Ascension is currently bugged. Even if you shoot, imagine you shot a shotgun that had 100 projectiles, you would expect to get around 10 triggers of Empathy with the Sword. Well, unfortunately, the way that it's working right now is that you will only be guaranteed 1. So, for any weapon that's using multiple projectiles, this is actually underperforming and doing less than 10% chance on average because per shot it can only trigger 1 time. And for that reason, it is something to avoid almost at all levels. The first level is okay sometimes as a way to trigger things like Sword Guard and Sword Enthusiast, but in general, it is very weak. Next up, we have Mark Chaser, and I've got all 3 levels of Mark Chaser in the Avoid Usually category here. Mark Chaser says each time that Fatal Bloom marks an unmarked enemy, increase the weapon damage and skill damage by a percentage, and at the max level, it gives you also some lucky shot and increases the duration just a little bit. The biggest problem with Mark Chaser, besides its relatively low numbers, is that the instances of the increase actually fall off separately. So if I do this on 5 different enemies, but every 5 seconds, I'm never going to have more than 2 instances of Mark Chaser active on me at once. And for that reason, you really can never get this to be giving you a huge amount of weapon and skill damage. And while ideally you would want to be using this in like the Blade of Bloom build or even the Blossom Enthusiast build, it turns out to just not be worth the Ascension point when there are other options. In the second slot of the Avoid Usually category, I've got the last level of Cursed Mark. Cursed Mark is a useful ability, especially its first point can be quite good against certain elites. And we can talk about that more in here just a bit. The problem with it is that the scaling is very linear, and you get the most value out of the Ascension with its first point. So in general, by the time you're at the 3rd level of Curse Mark, you're already getting as much value as you could hope for out of it, even maybe with the first point. So at this point, the 3rd level of Curse Mark is really not worth it, especially considering it offers no significant bonus like some 3rd tier Ascensions tend to do. And the blessing that we have in the Avoid Usually category is the Thorny Bloom blessing. This says, deal skill damage to the enemy when the mark of Fatal Bloom vanishes, and that is based on the additional triggers that you have triggered from your initial Fatal Bloom. So if you Fatal Bloom someone, you hit them 10 times, you trigger 1 extra Fatal Bloom, and then Thorny Bloom falls off, it's going to just do 1 instance of Fatal Bloom damage. So those are already pretty low numbers. And the big Thorny Bloom is pretty good in the sense that when you reapply a Fatal Bloom, when you apply the Blossom, it causes it to vanish and then reapply. So you're getting those triggers during the reapplication. And for that reason, technically Thorny Bloom is okay when you already have something like Blossom Enthusiast. But the problem is when you have Blossom Enthusiast, you're already doing insane damage and you don't need anything extra. And for that reason, Thorny Bloom doesn't really hold its weight on its own. And once you have Blossom Enthusiast, you really don't need more than that. So for that reason, I think it should be avoided in general. Much more useful here in the Nothing Better is one level of Ammo Extractor, which reads, killing an enemy that is marked with Fatal Bloom instantly recovers a percentage of ammo to the magazine, and at max level grants 1 stack of Blade Heart. So this initial level is sort of something that you can splash in most builds. If you're casting Fatal Bloom at all, then having a point in Ammo Extractor is only going to extend the magazine of your current weapon, and in general tends to be good. You tend to have weapons that could use that type of functionality. So 1 level in Ammo Extractor is almost going to hurt no build, and might be an option if there's nothing else there. In a similar vein, Flower Chain at level 1 is some basically free AoE damage. As long as you are casting Fatal Bloom sometimes, Flower Chain is going to be something that actually does spread out some damage. It's not super useful unless you're really taking advantage of it with some specific synergies, but it's better than picking everything else that's considered lower than this on the tier list. So worth splashing in is 1 point, definitely something to consider. At the top of the Nothing Better category, we have Swordsman, which might surprise you. Swordsman is a powerful Ascension. The main issue that I have with Swordsman is that it's only really a must-pick for something like the Blossom Enthusiast build. A lot of people think that Swordsman is very good in the Blade of Bloom build, but I very strongly beg to differ, and I'll talk about that now. The big problem with the Blade of Bloom build with Swordsman is that your Blade of Bloom levels pretty high. You're going to want to be using your swords out in combination with Blade of Bloom. At level 3, Blade of Bloom, it no longer cares what your current stacks of Blade Heart are. It just cares about what your max stacks are. So at that point, once you're at Blade of Bloom 3, you can start freely casting swords out without any reason not to. And so at that point, Swordsman becomes significantly worse. That being said, Swordsman is fairly good in the Blade of Bloom build, especially early on when you don't have that level 3, and for that reason, it is at the top of the Nothing Better list, because it tends to work in every build, even if it's not amazing in all of them. Next up, we have the Blade of the Bloom skill damage build. This build entirely focuses around the Blade of the Bloom Ascension and combining it with Ice Blade to do insane damage that scales very well into high reincarnation runs. As we go through these builds, I'm going to go from the top to the bottom, left to right, as opposed to bottom to top, just so you get a sense of how this is laid out. It'll make a little bit more sense if I do it that way. Let's go ahead and start off with Ice Blade, which we have at the very top of our blessings listed for this particular build. Ice Blade deals an additional 10% of the enemy's current HP as true damage upon hitting an enemy with a flying sword. Now, this damage is capped on elite monsters and bosses at 5,000 true damage, which is plenty, but it is not capped at all on normal enemies. And for that reason, it scales extremely well into high reincarnation runs. One thing to keep in mind about the way that Ice Blade works is because it has current HP, the actual percentage true damage you're doing is decreasing as their health decreases. And it's specific to red HP. So, enemies that have a large amount of shield and a small amount of red HP are going to, take damage in a fundamentally different way than something that's fully red HP. And hopefully you can think about that more as you're actually using the ability. This ability is extremely strong and should not be overlooked. It is the main activator for this build, and it is a must pick before you play it. Next up, as far as blessings is concerned, we've got the Ultimate Gambler blessing. This one allows you to refresh all of your ascensions once per goblet. The reason this is so useful and worth saying that it should be considered for the Blade of the Bloom build is that while I have distilled the Blade of the Bloom Ascensions down to these, there are a lot of Ascensions that work very well with Blade of the Bloom. So, it's very easy to ensure that you are getting something useful every time you get a goblet, especially with the Ultimate Gambler. You can really focus in and get the key Ascensions that you need to start doing insane damage. And getting those is more important on Blade of the Bloom than it is with Blossom Enthusiast and Swords Out defensive builds, because those builds are more reliant on weapon damage than the Blade of the Bloom build is, which is entirely reliant on skill damage and abusing the Ice Blade true damage. It should come as no surprise to you that the first 3 must-pick Ascensions for Blade of the Bloom are Blade of the Bloom. This says, after marking an enemy with Fatal Bloom, summon flying swords that are equal to a percentage of the current or maximum Blade Heart stacks rounded down. Each flying sword then homes in on a random marked enemy. So, a little bit of explanation in more layman's terms. Basically, each level of this, as it goes up, summons more stacks, or summons more swords based on your current stacks of Blade Heart. Okay? So, usually when people play Blade of the Bloom, even at level 3, what they're doing is they will hold a bunch of their Blade Heart stacks, and then they will use Blade of Bloom, and they will summon the maximum amount of stacks. So say you have 6 stacks of Blade Heart, that would be multiplied by 2.5, which would be 12 plus 3, that's 15 swords that would get summoned, and then those swords would rain down on everyone who was hit by your Fatal Bloom that you targeted. So if you target just one enemy, then they take all 15. But if you hit 3 enemies, then they sort of randomly spread out between those 3 enemies. Important to understand to play this build optimally, especially in High Reincarnation, is that Blade of Bloom 3 doesn't care about your current stacks, it cares about your maximum stacks of Blade Heart. And it rounds it down. Well, I don't care about the rounding down, but it cares about your maximum stacks of Blade Heart, okay? And the reason that matters is because once you get this to level 3, you no longer have to hoard your swords out. And now you can actually use your swords out in combination with Blade of Bloom to get even more swords pumping out and into your enemies' faces. And that's important to use. That is like the next level of how to use the Blade of Bloom build. Next up, we've got Furious Wave. Here in the Blade of Bloom build, Flying Sword has a 40% chance to deal double damage, and there's an additional 20% chance to deal 3 times damage when hitting an enemy who is marked with Fatal Bloom. Okay, let me pause. Okay, I broke out my calculator, and I think that overall Furious Wave is giving you around an 80% multiplicative increase on your actual swords that are dealing damage. And that's very, very good. That's exactly what we want to be seeing here. That sounds great. Next up we have Amplified Sword. And if you thought that I was going to need to break out the calculator for Furious Wave, there's quite a bit of that as far as Tao is concerned. She has a lot of these Ascensions that are a lot of stacking damage. It's not really clear how much damage they're doing. Case in point, we're going to come to Amplified Sword, level 3, which is the next pick here. Amplified Sword says, after hitting an enemy with a flying sword, the inflicted enemy takes more damage from flying swords for the next second or second and a half. So it can be stacked. And the idea is that you want to keep spamming your Fatal Bloom as fast as possible so that these Amplified Sword triggers don't fall off, so that you're constantly adding more and more damage to this Amplified Sword trigger. And that's where you're going to start getting a huge amount of damage on these really tanky enemies with the Amplified Sword coming in. Amplified Sword is multiplicative because it's a debuff that's applied to enemies, and so that's very strong. In general, the way to calculate this is to multiply the number of swords you're summoning by the percent increase, and then divide that by 2, and you will be getting the average of 1 instance of Blade of Bloom's damage increase each time you do it. It's a bit weird because the first sword that hits is not getting this it's getting just one increase, maybe just this 4%, but the last one is getting 4 plus, the 15 swords that have hit. So 15 times 4% is all increasing as well. So just keep in mind, multiply it by the number, then divide by 2, and you'll be getting a sense of how strong this is. And Altana taught me that little trick. Hopefully I'm not misquoting it. That would be unfortunate. But because this does multiplicative damage, because it can be stacked, because it does higher and higher damage against like bosses and stuff, this can be pretty strong. And for that reason, the level 3 should not be skipped. After that, we've got a very similar ability called Sword Enthusiast. For every flying sword summoned, increase weapon damage and skill damage by a certain amount for a certain amount of seconds. And if I'm not mistaken, this stacks and refreshes the cooldown. Unlike Mark Chaser, that the separate instances that built up... Oh, actually, I am mistaken. It's the same. Excuse me. Just like Mark Chaser, each instance of this that gets triggered falls off individually. But because you have 8 or 10 seconds, you have a long time to actually build up quite a bit of this. And that could be 5, 6 Fatal Bloom casts, maybe even more. Not sure exactly how fast that cast animation is. But you can build this number up to a very high number. And the longer you're going, the longer you're engaged in this Blade of Bloom style of play where you're painting the entire room, the more and more damage the Sword Enthusiast is going to do. And for that reason, we really want to pick up the level 3 of this if we get it offered before we go into the base of the build. Starting with Epic Swordcraft, you'll notice if we look sort of forward here that we're seeing 4 level 1 Ascensions. And there's a reason for that. These sort of form a crux of it's worth getting 1 point in each of these than like going hard into any one of these. And the first one of those is the Epic Swordcraft. This is a flying sword base damage, meaning this is a multiplicative damage increase, which is quite good. This gives us a strong basis for things that we've just talked about, like Sword Enthusiast and Amplified Sword, to ramp up their damage. And so after we get Epic Swordcraft, we want to get that first level in Amplified Sword, and then Sword Enthusiast, and then 1 level of Cursed Mark is actually quite useful in a build like this. Reducing movement speed by 30% is very powerful in certain elites, especially like the Spearmen in the Longling Tomb, and keeping people doing less damage to you is always a good thing. Minus 20% damage dealt is quite good. And it's worth noting that you get the most value out of Curse Mark from its first level. If we look here, at level 1 we get a 30% move speed, but as we go up each time, it's only 20%. And at level 1 we get a 20% damage reduction, but as we go up it's 15. So the first level of this is definitely the best scaled version of it. As we continue to level up, we're going to prioritize Epic Swordcraft, then Epic Swordcraft 2, Amplified Sword 2, Sword Enthusiast 2, and then, interestingly enough, I've moved Epic Swordcraft 3 behind all of these things. Notice that I've got 3 of Amplified Sword and Sword Enthusiast higher. The big problem here is that Epic Swordcraft level 3 doesn't actually give you any special bonuses, while the special bonus for level 3 of Sword Enthusiast and Amplified Sword are quite good and worth aiming for. So that's why I've got Epic Swordcraft at the very end. Next up, we have probably what is the most popular, powerful build that I see people using right now on Tau, which is the Blossom Enthusiast build. And this build does an insane amount of damage. It is absolutely bonkers. Start off this build by picking Blossom Enthusiast. This reduces the number of hits required to trigger Fatal Bloom. And what we're going to be doing is trying to really boost that Fatal Bloom additional damage up and use weapons that have a lot of actual projectiles and cause a lot of hits or a high rate of fire to trigger a huge amount of Fatal Bloom triggers. And that's going to really skyrocket our damage. So obviously, because this is named Fatal Blossom Enthusiast build. The first pick and required pick for this build is Blossom Enthusiast. Next up, a very powerful spiritual blessing to get is Skill Freak, which is a multiplicative double damage increase on the secondary skill. This is an invaluable boost to your damage. Most of the time, people re-roll the starting inscription until they get Blossom Enthusiast, and then they hope they can get lucky to get Skill Freak later. And you should feel lucky to get Skill Freak because your damage is going to significantly increase. The most important Ascension to get with the Blossom Enthusiast build is Glowing Bloom. Glowing Bloom is a 100, 200, 300% base damage, read multiplicative damage increase on the Fatal Bloom, and at max level it further reduces the required number of hits to trigger Fatal Bloom for its additional damage. Getting a level 3 Glowing Bloom with Blossom Enthusiast is a sight to behold. There is a lot of pink numbers on the screen, and they are doing lots of damage. Because this is also a multiplicative damage boost, you are skyrocketing the amount of damage each of these triggers are doing. And with Blossom Enthusiast, if you're using something like an illusion, a thunderclap glove, a laser glove, a scalpel with extra projectiles on its 2-shot mode, or any weapon that's abusing a no reload mechanic and has the extra projectiles inscription, these types of things are going to be doing absolutely bonkers damage with the Blossom Enthusiast build, and Glowing Bloom is the main catalyst for that damage to start really ramping up. Next up, we have No Escape. No Escape is a 1 point, and it says enemies marked by Fatal Bloom take 20% more damage, and the swords summoned by Swords Out will home in on those marked enemies. The main part and utility of this in this build is the 20% multiplicative damage increase. So that's great. We want that. That's easy. And even though it's only 20%, we want as many of those multiplicative damage boosts as we can, and this is a good one. After that, we started to get into a position where it's not exactly clear what the best possible decision. Those things form the crux of the Blossom Enthusiast build, and after that we're really not looking for very much in a very specific way. But Flower Chain can be a good next step, especially the first level when you're doing a Blossom Enthusiast build. When hitting an enemy that's marked by Fatal Bloom with a weapon, deal 100% weapon damage to up to a certain amount of marked targets. At the last level, if the initial hit is a crit hit, then so are the following hits, but their crit X will not exceed 3 times. So that's very strong and very useful. The idea here is that you have access to some easy AoE damage, and because you're doing a huge amount of damage already, it actually is increasing the amount of hits that you're getting on other enemies, because the flower chained hits can trigger the Fatal Bloom triggers. And this gets really, really out of hand with certain weapons like the Thunderclap gloves, where if you have enemies in an AoE around each other, they're all taking damage from the Thunderclap AoE, and then each of them is transferring the flower chain damage to the other people who are still in the AoE, and they sort of double dip in this like AoE damage taking loop. And it does crazy, crazy, crazy triggers. It's very powerful with this Blossom Enthusiast build. Because it's not super important for us to be casting Swords Out with the Blossom Enthusiast build, and we pretty much only want to be saving it for when we need it with Sword Guard, Swordsman is probably best served here in this build because it's the least likely that it's going to be packaged into the core of the build that you're going to be, spamming your swords out at any point in the game. And for that reason, an 8% weapon and skill damage per Blade Heart stack isn't amazing, but it's not something I wouldn't take. Because of the natural tendency toward this type of build being very weapon-centric, Ammo Extractor fits very well into it, combined not just because it's weapon-centric, but because you're casting a lot of Fatal Blooms. Enemies that you kill will have the Fatal Bloom debuff applied to them. And therefore, it makes Ammo Extractor very accessible and very powerful. Even if it's not triggering all the time, and even if you're not going for a no reload combo, which is situationally OP, it is just good to not have to reload as often, and Ammo Extractor allows you to do that more easily. In a similar vein that we talked about before, Cursed Mark finds its way into this build as a 1-point Wonder Splash, as a way to reduce enemies' movement and reduce their damage to you. 1 point of this tends to be quite useful, even if it's not something that you're particularly excited about. The main utility for it, as I've talked about on the Blade of Bloom build, is against certain elites, like the Spearman elite. Being able to slow that character by 30% is very useful and very powerful, and allows you to have a chance to beat him even in these high reincarnation runs, because he's very, very scary. After we've taken Cursed Mark, leveling up Flower Chain is a good idea, especially with certain weapons. They can really take advantage of Flower Chain's natural AoE double dipping, like Fire Dragon or Thunderclap gloves. And then we want to upgrade Ammo Extractor with future levels, just to get more and more ammo back as we absolutely slaughter people. What's the word I'm looking for? Indiscriminately. That's what I was looking for. And that completes the Blossom Enthusiast build. Now let's move on to a build that I don't see a lot of, but I think is extremely powerful, and that is the Swords Out defensive build, which just got buffed in Gunfire 1.0 release. The starting Ascension for this build is the Sword Mastery Blessing. This allows you to stack Blade Heart even when Swords Out is on cooldown. The main function and the main reason we would want to do that is that this build focuses around summoning a lot of swords with Swords Out, which will buff us because of Swords Guard to have a really, really high amount of shield. Sorry, my dog barked. Okay, crisis averted. Alright, so talking about the Swords Out defensive build, and Sword Mastery is what we're talking about, which allows us to stack Blade Heart even when Swords Out is on cooldown. The idea being that we want to be able to cast Swords Out every time it comes off cooldown. So our goal with this build is to be able to expend all of the required consumed ammo such that in like the 2 seconds, or I can't remember the cooldown exactly. Okay, the cooldown is about 4 seconds once your talent tree is maxed out. This blessing may seem a bit underwhelming, but once you get a sense of how to use and how safe this build can be, you might start to like it a little bit more. The second Ascension blessing that you might want to pick for this build is Ice Blade. Because we are going to be summoning a huge amount of swords with our defensive build, Ice Blade fits really nicely into this package with what we're doing, and gives us some access to some really easy damage that scales very well. It is hard to choose whether or not to pick Sword Mastery or Ice Blade first. Both of them work pretty well with this build. I would say Sword Mastery is more defensive, Ice Blade is more aggressive, and it's tough to say which one is better overall. The recently buffed / fixed Ascension that is the first pick for the Swords Out defensive build is Sword Defense, which reduces damage taken while casting Swords Out. And this damage reduction is 30%, 50%, 70%, and you cannot die while this is happening at level 3. And so level 3 is very good, because what you're going to find is that because we can cast Swords Out, because if we play smart and we really use a very high consumption weapon and build our Blade Heart stacks up very quickly, we can almost permanently keep Swords Out going, which makes Sword Defense very, very strong at level 3. The way that we do that is Sword Shadow. Sword Shadow, what it does is each stack of Blade Heart summons 1, 2, 3 additional flying swords with Swords Out. Seems like weak, not that strong, but let me tell you, okay? The reason Sword Shadow is good is because it extends the duration that Swords Out is casting, which extends, therefore, the duration of sword defense. So the longer that Swords Out takes to cast because of Sword Shadow, the longer sword defense is going to be active. So that's why these two things pair so well together. Not only that, but because it takes longer for Swords Out to complete, it's much better defensively to get your heals, your shield heal and your shield max increase from Sword Guard over time, as opposed to the way you get it in Blade of Bloom. In Blade of Bloom, and I neglected to mention this, which is a bit unfortunate, but alas. But in Blade of Bloom, you get this Sword Guard trigger intermittently as your swords get summoned every couple seconds. And because of that, if you take a lot of damage at once in between those instances of casting Fatal Bloom, you can die unexpectedly. But Swords Out defensive build, you're summoning so many swords and you're summoning them so consistently that Sword Guard is sort of always healing and adding stuff, and it really keeps you a lot healthier because you're always getting a better value for the damage you're taking. And so that's Sword Shadow. After we pick Sword Shadow level 1, we want at least one level of sword defense, and then we get our 1-point wonder of Cursed Mark. That fits really well in a defensive build. We're going to be stacking not only a defense of damage reduction, but we're going to reduce the damage that they're doing as well, and that fits perfectly with what we're trying to do. It is important that we do some damage, and Ice Blade does solve that to some degree, but because of the sheer amount of swords that we summon with this build, Sword Enthusiast fits very well, and especially because this is a weapon damage based build, Sword Enthusiast fits very well into what we're doing. So Sword Enthusiast will increase our weapon and skill damage. It'll make our swords do more damage, even though that damage is negligible and not really that important. But especially at level 4, we're getting Lucky Shot and significant damage increase for a significant amount of time, and we're summoning a huge amount of swords, which means that we're able to really add up to some important, useful, meaningful damage with just one damage ascension in this particular build, barring the Ice Blade blessing, of course. After that, we want to take Sword Shadow level 2 and level 3, and then pop back for Sword Defense level 2. Then we can finish off our Sword Enthusiast level 2 and level 3, and then it is worth taking No Escape here at this point. No Escape, especially if you have Ice Blade, can be quite strong in this build because Ice Blade will No Escape will cause your swords to home in, and with Ice Blade that can be very useful. So No Escape does have a spot here, especially with the Ice Blade blessing. And then after that, Luminous Heart is good in this build, but it's nothing crazy. Because it increases your max stacks, it does work best when it's combined with stuff like Sword Shadow, as opposed to when it's combined with Blade of the Bloom, because it doesn't really add a huge amount of stacks to Blade of the Bloom. It's not bad, don't get me wrong. And in fact, I would say that if I could go back right now and change this, I probably would add some Luminous Heart in here in the Blade of Bloom build. But the thing about the Blade of Bloom build is so many Ascensions fit into it. Too many Ascensions fit into it. So I've tried to distill it down to just the most important ones, and I don't think that Luminous Heart quite made the cut. That being said, it is fairly good in the Swords Out defensive build. It extends what you're already trying to do, which is summon a lot of swords, and to use that for a defensive purpose. It extends the duration of casting Swords Out. It does more swords, which is better for Sword Guard. So in general, it really synergizes with what the defensive build is trying to do. Next up, we have the Situationally OP category. This starts off with something that might be a little interesting, the Supreme Craftsman. You can re-roll inscriptions of a weapon at the Craftsman. Each Craftsman can re-roll up to 3 times. The reason I have included this blessing is because of the way that you can abuse Ammo Extractor on Tau. Tau has one of the few ways to set up a no reload synergy just by herself and just by playing well. With the new 1.0 release, a lot of Ascensions that set up a no reload synergy, which is something like the Demon Lore plus Advanced Depot. That's a no reload synergy. Or a Scalpel with plus 0.2 projectiles per kill, resets on reload. If you have that and say some way to never have to reload, to constantly be filling that magazine, then you're going to just be staying at 2 extra projectiles, which is a 200% multiplicative damage boost on that weapon, which is absolutely bonkers. So you can use Supreme Craftsman to actually re-roll for some of those OP inscriptions like the plus 0.2 projectiles per kill. And if you have a weapon that it would be ideal on, that has some, like it's just the base weapon you're looking for that type of thing for, giving this a couple re-rolls and shooting for that OP inscription would make an ammo extractor build very, very, very powerful. One way that this can be done even better is by giving it the mag share, which further increases your flexibility and like how much ammo you can consume before you really need to you need to have some way to fulfill it or to fill that ammo up again. So that's what that is all about. Apologies for not being entirely elegant there. I've also included Flower Chain here in the Situationally OP category, mostly because of the way that it works with Thunderclap Gloves. Thunderclap Gloves with Flower Chain is almost a build on its own. There's a lot of ways that you can play that particular build, but the essential idea is that the essential idea is, say you have like 3 enemies, and then you hit all of them. Colors, there they are. Let's say you hit this guy, right? Okay, and so, oh gosh, we need a circle around him, right? This is making sense. Okay, so that is the Thunderclap Gloves hitting one target. All these enemies have Fatal Bloom on them. Okay, that means with Flower Chain, they're all going to chain together. So the way that Thunderclap Gloves works is it hits a target and then does an AoE hit. So each of these units get hit with the AoE, and then each of them also chain because of Flower Chain. So this one changed to these two, then this one chains to this guy and to that guy, and then this guy chains to that guy and to that guy. And you get this sort of loop of damage, which makes them all be taking 3 instances of damage per tick of the Thunderclap Gloves. And this starts to get really crazy with larger groups of people and larger levels of Flower Chain, where you just see people insta-die. Because once you have 5 enemies all sharing 5 chains between themselves, the whole screen turns pink and they just, your game crashes even potentially. So that is situationally OP. At the second slot, we're finally at the top of the mountain here. We're in the always pick category. These are the 2 best Ascensions on Tau and really do a lot of work in carrying Tau in high reincarnation runs. These are pretty much the bread and butter, and the better you know how to use these, the better you're going to be at Tau. The first of these is Warlike Blade. Warlike Blade says for every 10 ammo consumed for the next 3 seconds, increase your rate of fire, your accuracy, and there's a chance to recover ammo consumed when firing, and this can stack 3, 3, and 5 times. Okay, so this Ascension turns fast-firing weapons into literal laser beams, and that's exactly the type of thing that you want to be doing on Tau. Warlike Blade really ramps up anything that you already want to do and takes it to that nth level. Really just perfectly synergizes with everything you want to be doing with Tau, and works great. It's good in almost every build, maybe not the Blade of Bloom build, but just about anything else you'd be wanting to do. It's great when you do something like a wild hunt with a mag share. You've got Warlike Blade, which is recovering ammo as you're shooting that wild hunt. And when you have 5 stacks of this, 5 times 15 is the percentage to recover ammo consumed when firing, and your magazine extends huge, big time, very, very, very big extension of those magazines, and stuff starts to get really crazy. A couple levels of Warlike Blade plus the ammo extractor is what really makes these situationally OP no reload synergies possible on Tau. It's really Warlike Blade and ammo extractor working together. And so that's one of the reasons that Warlike Blade works so well there. It increases our rate of fire a lot, which is really good for the Swords Out defensive build because we can consume enough ammo so that we can constantly be casting our Swords Out with a high amount of Blade Heart stacks. It allows us to shoot faster and more accurately, triggering more Blossom Enthusiast build hits so that we can do huge amounts of damage by triggering lots of Fatal Bloom triggers. It really, really works with just about everything. It even works with the flower chain, and you know what? It can't be too bad in the Blade of Bloom build because you're probably going to shoot your weapon at least a little bit, but maybe it's not the best in that one. At the very top of the list is not the best Ascension in the game, but definitely the must pick on Tau because Tau is very easy to kill. She does not have a lot of strategies to keep herself alive, unless you're playing in a very specific way. But Sword Guard works with just about everything you'd want to be doing, even the Blossom Enthusiast build that doesn't really have anything else going for it. And it's one of the few ways that Tau can really improve her survivability. Now, I have a video where I go into detail about Sword Guard and the very strange way that it works. But suffice it to say that unintuitively, if you just have level 1 of Sword Guard, the optimal time that you would want to be casting that is after you've taken a little bit of damage. So if you've got 105 shield and you get knocked down to 65 shield, that would be the perfect time to cast Sword Guard. You're gonna get around 88 total healing out of level 1 Sword Guard if you cast it right then. If you take more damage, you'll get less healing, and if you use it at full, you'll get the least amount of healing from Sword Guard. Now, I don't want to go too far into why that's the case, but it has to do with the fact that for each sword summoned, it increases max shield and recovers shield. It's doing this both thing, which is why you're getting these weird numbers. But Sword Guard is something that you need to learn how to use correctly, and I will make sure to put that video linked over here in the top right of the screen so that you can learn how to do that, because it is integral to being able to take Tau into these high reincarnation runs with any consistency. And I think that does it for Tau. I think that is fairly comprehensive. I have really put a lot of effort into trying to learn Tau. I don't think Tau is a very strong character right now. I do think that she can be good. Things like Ice Blade and Bloom Enthusiast are very powerful. But she has very little build variety. And she's a bit hard to understand. Most of her builds take a long time to start doing a lot of damage. And the damage that they tend to do is really just kind of built off of her blessings, as opposed to the actual ascensions themselves being very powerful. Stuff like Amplified Sword and Sword Enthusiast, and even Sword Guard to some degree, while they do give you benefits, the numbers feel a little weak to be really being something that's consistent in solo right now. When I compare Tau's survivability to the Turtle survivability, it is, two different worlds, and survivability is everything in these high reincarnation runs. So hopefully this is useful to you. Hopefully this is something that you were able to learn from. Please let me know if there's any detail or any particular take that you have a different opinion on. I am definitely not the best at Tau, but I did put quite a lot of time into learning her to make sure that when I when I did this tier list that I was, based on quite a bit of experiences, and I made sure that some of the people in the Discord looked at it before I posted it as well. So if you do have some opinions about maybe something I missed or that you think that could be better set up, please let me know, and then I will pin that in the comments. Sorry, it's getting a little late here. I'll pin that in the comments, and that way other people can see it. Thank you for your time. Hopefully this was useful. Have an excellent day, and I'll see you next time.